My name is Stephanie Sherwood, and I am the curator of Portals. I proposed Portals to Angels Gate Cultural Center back in spring of 2020 as an exhibition that looks at gateways and doorways as the potential for change. And it was specific to the gallery's location, which overlooks the Port of Los Angeles. The Port of Los Angeles is a massive economic entity, and the exhibition really speaks to how the Port of Los Angeles transformed the city of Los Angeles. The exhibition features artworks which contemplate ideas of boundaries, entrance and egress, progress, and travel into the unknown. With those ideas in mind, I was super fortunate to be able to work with an amazing group of artists, all with vastly different practices, whose work really comes at this idea of portals from different angles. The exhibition feels really bright and expansive in that way. We have drawing, we have painting, we have video art, we have a documentation of an earthwork, we have fiber art, we have sculpture, we have large-scale sculpture, and we have site-specific installations. I am thrilled to have been able to bring together this amazing group of artists in such an amazing gallery space here at Angels Gate Cultural Center. The team here is so wonderful and supportive, and they really helped me realize my vision. There were so many magical little moments that happened once we actually brought the work into the space, and it made me feel like the universe really said yes to the ideas that we're working with here.
I'm very excited to share my new installation work, Blue Memories, Flooding Back, Navigating Tongva Waters. I did not start my career doing this mixed media installation work. I started off doing these tiny works that were all jewelry, functional art, and that sort of led to this journey of just going bigger and bigger. The work itself has really become not just about this form and shapes that are creating these beautiful objects, but also really about the content. For this particular installation, I was going back in time, which is actually what I do in my practice a lot, which is looking at history to understand where we are today. And in this piece, I went all the way back to 15,000 years ago, looking at the population that was here before any of this was here in San Pedro. And that took me on this journey of really learning about. There was hundreds of communities that were here, and they had their own system for navigating the water, which was these masterful canoes. So in the work itself, I'm really taking you on this sort of counterclockwise journey with imagery, looking at who were those inhabitants, and then moving our way slowly up. And to do that, I'm using imagery from those canoes, from battleships, as it was a war port. They were using it for boats and ships and planes. Again, I'm taking you on this journey, and it's kind of a bittersweet journey. It's talking about the removal of people. It's talking about colonialism. It's talking about the switchover to this global port, which is actually something that is, could be seen as positive. We're getting all of the things we need, but at the same time, it's hurting the environment. So I'm really touching on all of these levels and layers of what the port was and has become. It was a learning lesson on so many levels in terms of creation and in terms of history. So I was just so grateful to have the opportunity to show and be a part of the rest of these amazing artists that are here.
I have no musical training. I'm not a musician, but I am Jewish, and Judaism is a really oral culture. It's very textual and oral. And so growing up in that tradition in a very observant household really oriented me towards the sound aspect of everyday life and the act of listening. So the works in the show they relate to that, and they also relate to the Jewish ritual object, the shofar. It's a ram's horn that's blown during celebrations, but it also is supposed to have mystical, transformative powers. I love that idea that sound can be transformative and can have power, and we know that to be true. People speaking out and demonstrating and working together, making their voices heard, can make change and can have an impact. The large horn that's in the exhibition is inspired by this folk musical instrument called the mega kazoo horn, and it was made by this folk music legend, Charles Chase. It's a 6-person instrument and it has siren whistles. I thought it would be more interesting to have 6 speaking tubes so that people could have their voices be amplified, and also would create a situation where they would have to listen to one another and coordinate with one another. And then the histophones, those sculptures I originally thought about as listening devices. I was thinking about the way that my grandfather would cup his hand to his ear. And even if you do that, you can really amplify sound. It really changes sound, just that simple gesture. Even though it's covering your mouth, it has a hole, and that goes to the bell of a trumpet, so it actually amplifies your voice. And there's this really interesting contradiction between being silenced but then having resiliency regardless. And I just love that.
So I was raised in what I felt like was a pretty strict Catholic family. And there were many things about the church that I did not like, but there were some kind of gems that I feel like I was able to pull with me throughout my life, and that was focus on a sense of mystery, magic, looking at kind of the bigger picture of life and having this awareness of death and really living your life with a sense of purpose. And so that was kind of a focal point for a big part of my life. And even though I eventually left the church, I feel like some of that level of awareness of big picture thinking and questioning stuck with me. Around 2013, I started making installations based on the idea of the wall as a threshold. And so having elements that existed inside of the wall, having 3-dimensional forms that were illusionistically looking like they were emerging from the wall and then existing in the 3D space, the physical space. And so in the beginning, that threshold was really this metaphor for things that are unknown versus known, things that are invisible to us versus visible. And then over time, I also started to think of it as this kind of space that didn't necessarily connect with time or our reality here on the physical plane, that it's this other kind of alternate plane. And thinking in terms of ideas of pre-existence, and if there is some aspect of us that exists before we were born, and then there's that emergence into the physical world, crossing that threshold, and then living our lives in the physical plane, and then if there is some way that part of us then returns to that. The piece in this show is called The Subtle Body Prepares for Emergence, and it's based on the number 7. And in this piece, you'll see that there are the 7 chakras. For me as an artist, I'm really interested in highly technical work. I appreciate that artist's hand, and so I wanted to push myself to make work that was more complex, that pushed me technically, and then also just pushing that idea of that mystical kind of space and what types of forms could possibly exist there. So that's when I started getting into ideas around geometry and then sacred geometry, which takes things to that next plane of looking for bigger kind of universal patterns. That sense of satisfaction in the resolution that math can provide. Whereas art is so subjective, and oftentimes there's multiple solutions to an artistic design problem or something like that.
There's not so much revealed. Like, I'm not really telling you that much. There's like space for the viewer to enter from wherever they're coming from and sort of like insert their own meaning or like understanding into the work. I don't know if it's the sparsity or just like the like a clean, like kind of blank, almost objectist. I worked in a neon shop in Brooklyn for about 6 years, which is where I became familiar with the material. And I always thought the small details were overlooked in commercial signs and art. And I wanted to highlight those details. So I made my own glass stands, which are these little plastic bits that hold the neon to whatever surface or wall that you mount it to. In some ways, I was making empty signs, highlighting the materials themselves and reflecting the surrounding environment. I was like in a place where I didn't know what I was working on, and I just had this sketchbook that I would just drew these like blobby shapes. And for whatever reason, I would just draw one and turn the page and draw another and turn the page. It takes like a lot of energy and resources to make a neon sign. And some of them I just thought were like a little silly. I was investing a lot in this like really simple shape, and in some ways elevating a really simple shape. And there's something kind of sweet, poetic about that. Just like, oh, it's really simple, but now like brings more importance to this really simple shape.
Conceptually, my work is about the connection and kind of the growing disconnect between people and the natural world that's immediately outside of our bodies. And I'm visually exploring natural forms from the smallest organisms and plants and fungi to the unfathomably large geological formations on scales that are kind of incomprehensible. And I'm really fascinated by these forms in and of themselves, but I'm also looking at ways to draw parallels between them and the human experience. I wanted to reimagine this static, solidified part of someone's interaction with landscape as a dynamic, kind of moving, liquefying portal of sorts that gradually shifts from solid to liquid state the closer you get to it, and eventually basically opening up into air and light. So it goes from a solid state to like a complete transformation. There is oftentimes in these works kind of an underlying narrative of transformation. It's a theme that I keep coming back to from kind of different angles. And the work in the show includes a series of sequential drawings that talk about transition between realms, between states of matter, right? From going from solid to liquid to gas and air and light. There's a line from Ursula Le Guin that I keep coming back to in my work. She said, one way to stop thinking about rivers and hills and trees as just natural resources is to class them as fellow beings or as kinfolk. And that's something that's kind of at the root of how I think about these things in my work. And kidney is loosely based on a comparison between, the organ and lakes and rivers and kind of naturally occurring bodies of water. And when I was making the body of work that this piece came out of, I was reading about bodies of water that were in some way directly affected by human activity, positively or negatively, right? So there are lakes, for example, that have for generations sustained different communities that have more or less permanently dried up because of climate change. And now, these communities have no sustenance, essentially. There are also rivers in different parts of the world that are being granted legal protection status, like personhood, essentially.
I think color is the thing that attracted me to painting as a young artist. I mean, the desire to work with paint in a physical way was all about wanting to touch color. And I think when it comes to learning about color, I totally believe in the primacy of painting. Although I don't make oil paintings anymore, I was trained as an oil painter, the physical act of pushing paint around a palette or adding paint to mix a particular color is not only a way of touching color for me, but it's given me a really acute understanding of how to match mixed color that I'm looking for, and also an understanding of what the parents of any given color are. Color always comes first. I'm trying to develop a sense of light and atmosphere in the work, and I'm often trying to create or disrupt figure-ground relationships through sensitive use of value or attention to temperature. All of my work is generative in the sense that the images are coming from the ecosystem of the studio. It's always filtered through some form of drawing. I've been working with a kind of a group of what I consider to be elemental forms of landscape. We are familiar with spaces like this, like a garden is this kind of space. It's a it's an unnatural landscape that is both like detached from the world and also part of the world, right? Like it's an escapist environment that also makes you feel more aware of being in the landscape. And it's a purely constructed space. You know, only human beings do this, make gardens. So it's inherently a creative space. And it also factors heavily into, you know, mythology and literary narrative. And there's lots of loaded symbology about spaces like gardens.
I recognize there's a link with raw and natural materials, such as the dirt and wax on the beginning and end drawings, and the raw canvas that's applied to the open space bandage paintings, as well as earth itself in the earthwork called surface. It's also nice to see the drawings, paintings, and the earthwork speak to each other all in one place. When I look at them, I reflect on all the years and how each body of work supports one another. Drawings are about being an artist and creating, which is informed by the paintings. The paintings aren't traditional paintings of images or abstractions, but rather a restructuring of what a painting can be. So each painting or series of paintings lead to one another. Also, as for surface, the earthwork, that was informed by the shapes and the structure of my paintings. So its purpose was to alter our visual relationship and perspective of the earth. Changing the perspective of what a painting can be, or how a writing can become a drawing, that interests me. When I think of a portal, I think of an unknown space that you would enter in either a physical or a conceptual way. If I think of it this way, each of my paintings really is a portal in itself. So reversing process and the use of materials, that helps me find things I usually would not see. I was entrenched in high school teaching. Every day, over 500 kids a day. That did not enter my studio at all. In fact, I didn't paint when I was teaching. Pretty much because you have to give 100% to each practice. It's either you're 100% teaching or you're 100% painting in the studio.
I do record dreams and sometimes inject parts of dreams into, the process of making and the process of creating characters and whatnot. Probably what is noticeable in a lot of the smaller pieces, the applique and the smaller components to the bigger pieces, is this distinctive, dramatic expression on a lot of the characters' faces. And I call it the screaming skull motif. And it actually stems from a piece that I finished and showed just before lockdown. It's a heavy piece, and then I was doing that in amongst, the developing pandemic, the horrific injustices, the social unrest. It represents a precipice, the transformation of a huge amount of energy from one form to another. And in that piece, it related to death. And that piece more specifically was about the violence that is incurred when femmes are killed by their lovers. For me, I make something and then a lot of the layers of meaning come from sitting with it after it's been brought into existence. It became quite a focus for me because I think, I was still sort of processing the previous work, and with all of the sort of psychological, emotional kind of upheaval. The first job I actually got in the States was in the fashion industry. So I was working at kind of an all-in-one shop, kind of design, manufacture, pack and ship off apparel for designers. What I noticed was that a lot of fabric would be thrown out in general. And so there's just this massive amount of fabric that would end up getting placed in the dumpsters, and I would hoard that stuff in my apartment. So it's definitely affected in the way that I make the work, the process of it. And the color palette is it's definitely evolved. And I am super drawn to bright, and I am limited in terms of like what was on trend like a couple of seasons ago. So that's really interesting. I tend to, if I see something I like, then I will try to grab as much of it as I can, just because I'm not sure when it will become kind of like in trend again. And that's especially when it comes to like the neon kind of colors. And neon's really interesting because it's such a niche color palette. It's like it's an artificially conjured palette that we have created, not found in nature. And I find a really interesting link between that concept and these sort of deities, these anti-heroes, these like manifestations of my imagination. And they are not from this realm. They're something that I have conjured. So I kind of like that. So I've kind of got this weird sort of connection to neon as this sort of like supernatural sort of palette.
This piece is called Death of a Star. And it comes from educational or instructional films, like about the universe, how in billions of years the sun will expand or contract. So, and then in a way like that negation, so you have like something very fast with something actually like very slow. If you think of it as a depiction of a cosmic event, meaning that you have 46 seconds of animation, but if it depicts like 100 billion years, then what does it mean? So like originally my practice actually started sculptural, and installations and light was always a key component in it. And then in the last few years I kind of made a full circle and went back to painting. But light and space is something that is kind of always there. So as a video being like a completely digital work, this is actually my first work that's a video, because I would use film, I would use any kind of lighting elements, so not specifically a film, but to have that like a projection in a way. So that whole idea has always been there with me, but this is just the first time that it's a digital projection. I had in mind the feeling of what the poet is more as what it means politically. And like this work has like it somehow deals with like a cosmic imagery, but it's also kind of like it can be seen like as how you needed the stars to navigate the sea. It kind of connected with that, like with the port being a place of entry or exit to a civilization even.